everyone, Ann Wyatt here, Vice President of Client Success for HealthFitness. Welcome to the HealthFitness Podcast. All right, when it comes to benefits, perks, and on-site amenities like fitness and well-being services, employers are increasingly asking, is it worth it? So today's episode, we're going to discuss the real benefits and value for employers who do invest in these types of programs and services. My guest today is Dr. Tyler Amell. Dr. Amell, I have a lot to share about him, and I got to put my glasses on so I can get all the details. He is Chief Health and Strategy Officer at MediKeeper. He is an internationally recognized thought leader and keynote speaker on workplace health and productivity, and he's a trusted advisor to organizations, including employers, healthcare, service providers, insurers, and investment firms on strategic and integrated workplace health and productivity. But wait, there is more. He holds an adjunct faculty position at Pacific Coast University for workplace health sciences. So, Dr. Amell, it is such a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for the invitation, Ann. I've been looking forward to this session for a little while now.
Me too. Well, let me start. Before we dive into all the fun of workplace productivity and integration with all these great strategies, I want to talk a little bit about HealthFitness's 50th anniversary. You may have heard that we are celebrating that this year. And as a result, we've been asking our guests, we've been looking at all the trends over the last 50 years. And I want to know from you, is there a favorite trend you had over the years in the area of fitness?
Oh, that's a really good question. And first of all, congratulations, 50 years in today's day and age. That you might as well be 100 years old at that rate.
This is true.
Excellent. I'm a big fan of outdoor sports and activities. I was just on a nature podcast not that long ago where we talked about the role nature plays in your health. And so,
Right.
we covered on some very interesting things. So activities like downhill skiing, mountain biking, hiking is another one on my list. I'm a former competitive mountain biker and ski racer, ski instructor, ski coach, and that sort of thing. I also enjoy golf, but the only time your heart really elevates when you're playing golf is when you hit a bad shot. So it's not really that much for physical fitness.
Let's dive into the topic at hand. So,
Mhm.
with any program, there's an investment, and demonstrating that value, of course, is key. But what should employers be paying attention to? I know at one point ROI was the gold star, then VOI followed right after that. But what are you seeing today?
Yeah, again, it's a good question. When we talk about the concept of ROI, it stands for return on investment. VOI is value on investment. There's lots of research out there that is, pointing to the fact that yes, there is a return on investment for investing in the health of your people. I look at things primarily from a human resources and an organizational perspective, and so you'll kind of hear that sort of peek through in our conversation as we go through it. And so, the cynics out there are going to say, well, the only reason we talk about value on investment is because there's no return on investment, which is it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine because it's not the case whatsoever. In fact, I gave a keynote recently at an International Foundation of Employee Benefit Plans conference in Florida, and it was actually on the return on investment and value on investment and what employers should be focusing in on. And so, we can say unequivocally that there is a return on investment in these types of programs, particularly well-being, physical fitness, mental health solutions. And, whenever I speak about health, I talk about it in the broadest sense. So we're talking about smoking cessation programs. We're talking about all the things that you can tie a link back to the health of the people that make up the organization. And so we cast the net far and wide.
So, what is one myth about wellness ROI or VOI that you wish you could bust for good?
Oh, that's a good one, Ann. um, given the fact that I wear a lot of these hats, and Mythbuster is now apparently one of them as well, I've had the pleasure of being in the boardroom, representing employers' interests when vendors come in to sell on a solution. I'm usually in the role of an independent advisor, and I'm there to either say, yeah, this makes sense from a science and evidence-informed perspective, or you know what, this doesn't make sense. You're probably not going to get those outcomes, and perhaps we should be looking elsewhere. elsewhere. And I'm always amazed at some of the companies out there who are touting, significant return on investment, so significant ROI.
Mm-hmm.
I've
Right.
actually heard people claiming, 10, 12, 15%
Oh,
returns, or 15 times return, which is it's just unheard of, right? You don't necessarily
right.
see that. And so that's a myth that I would bust. And how I counter that with employers, and I'm like, okay, let's take off your HR hat, and you're not part of the organization, but you're looking at your 401k, or you're looking at your retirement savings, and you're meeting with a financial planner. And think
Right.
of the financial planner here as a company out there trying to get somebody to an organization to invest in the health of their people. And if you said, from a return perspective, we're going to give you 15 times your money back, that's like a unicorn, would you believe them? Right? Would
Right.
you,
Right.
Ann? Like, if I was trying to sell you a
It's
financial
too good to be
product?
true.
Too good to be true. Absolutely. And in fact,
It
it is. And when
typically
you,
is, right?
yeah, and when you look at things, the S&P 500, as a broad index, you know, we're talking about annualized returns of about 10% and 6 to 7% if you incorporate inflation. And
Right.
so,
Right. Right.
why is that okay for 401ks and investments, but yet when it comes to health and productivity, we need to be talking multiple times? It just doesn't make any sense, from
No.
my perspective. So that would be the biggest myth I would want to bust right from the get go.
Right. A little dose of reality. I love it. So you have exposure to a lot of different companies and organizations. Are employers, especially, are they realizing programs really aren't any longer a nice to have, but really part of that bigger key initiative and strategy they should be putting into their businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. I did a fair bit of speaking on this topic during the height of the pandemic,
Hmm.
where, the health of the worker was finally put into the spotlight, right? We hadn't
Right.
seen that for a very long time. Usually the health of the worker is, it's an afterthought for most organizations out there.
Sure.
Even though we have issues with mental health, with burnout, with rust out, stress, anxiety, depression, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, musculoskeletal conditions, like you name it. Those things haven't gone away. All that happened was, during the pandemic, suddenly protecting and promoting the health of the workforce became a priority for a lot more organizations out there. And so that's really forced them to rethink, their historical approaches to how they protect and promote the health of the people. And so we've seen that carry forward, and here we are a few years later. And most organizations, especially the ones who are interested in the long haul, and to be good community stewards, and good employers, and be at the top of those lists, they're finding that they have to treat this, less as a nice to have, and a luxury, and more as,
Mm.
this is the way you should be doing business. This is the way you should be conducting yourselves as an employer, because this is how you attract, recruit, and retain the best and the most talented people out there. Now,
Right.
from our perspective, and look at it through Health Fitness's lens, you want people to be retained, right? And that part of
Yes.
that is making sure that they're at work and productive, and injury and illness free. And we know that there's a mountain of evidence to support, physical fitness and mental fitness. And so, having these sort of things in place, recontextualized as an attraction, recruitment, and retention tool, emphasis on the retention side of things,
Hmm.
it's quite powerful. And then when you layer on the attraction and recruitment from a benefit perspective, this is what employees are looking for. They're looking for flexible benefits. They're looking to know that the
Right.
employer has their back, and to be able to support them. And so that's part of the employee value proposition at this point in time, which I think is really helping move the conversation forward. So it's not a luxury that should be looked at taking away, but more, how can we improve our approaches and our strategies to get better results here and to best support people.
Right. Oh, I love that. So, when you think about soft outcomes, what kind of soft outcomes could a company be looking to at to so they could assess VOI?
Yeah, so there's a few of them. Some of the research clearly points to the fact that, people who participate in wellness and health programming have a primary healthcare practitioner, and so if you've got 20-30% of your population of workers that don't have that resource to begin
Mm-hmm.
with, and that becomes a measure, it's not tied to a financial return, but it's a pretty good outcome with regards to helping people embark on that health improvement strategy. Because as a population, we're not healthy, right? There's all our markers for the most part are going in the wrong direction.
So you had talked about productivity just a question or two ago, and it's being talked about a ton right now, of course. It seems like everyone needs to focus on productivity, but at the same time, we're thinking that you want to make sure there's a balance between making sure they're productive, but we're also avoiding the burnout. And you also mentioned that too. So, why is it being talked about so much right now?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that I link health and productivity is because it opens more doors. Whenever you go
Mhm.
into an employer and you go to HR and you go to CFO and you say, "Hey, let's talk about the health of your people," historically, prior to the pandemic, those doors were closed pretty quickly. A lot of people didn't want to hear about how important the health of their people was. Smart
Right.
organizations do, and those are the ones that you actually want to work for and be an active member of the community in. Now, when you link it to productivity, suddenly that gets everybody's ears perked up, and it's like, So what I do try and do is make the association that you can't have productive employees without a foundation of health, and
Right.
so that opens up a lot more doors and it gets people to buy into the idea much more readily. So here we're talking about absence leave, disability programming, those sort of things. That's that retention piece that I mentioned earlier around, we attract with the benefit plan, we recruit them, we bring them into the organization, and we retain them through our health and benefit strategy, and we pull on all the levers associated with that. So, it's really a marketing ploy whenever you link health and productivity together.
Hmm.
Now, now we can look at it a little bit differently, and especially through the lens of mental health. And we mentioned burnout for a specific reason.
Right.
I've been tracking the amount of people on anxiolytic drugs. So those are anti-anxiety medications as well
Hmm.
as antidepressant medications. We have broken a year in terms of the number of prescriptions written and filled every year for the past about 15 years. So this
Wow.
started in 2009, 2010. So we're breaking records every year. Not the kind of records we should be
I want to say that's not a record
breaking.
we want to break, right?
No, no, absolutely not. But we're doing a really good job of breaking them, and so you have more people than ever. Well, part of it is the reduction of stigma. There's more people open to the idea
Right.
of talking about issues around stress, anxiety, depression, these sort of things. And so when we bring in the concepts of burnout, we know that work-life balance or work-life blending is some of the things that I like to say. These are critical to that productivity conversation in the workplace. We're still talking about the health side of things and things that we can do to protect and promote, but we're layering in the other aspects to basically get the buy-in and the understanding from that perspective. Plus, as I alluded to, absenteeism, presenteeism which is when people are at work but not necessarily as productive as they normally are due to a
Hmm.
health related issue. And then disability, short-term disability, long-term disability, workers compensation, all the absence episodes elements all sort of come into play. So you can see how there's a vested interest on behalf of the employer to invest in the health of their people to get the better outcomes so that people are able to do that.
Right. And is there research out there that these employers can rely on so that they can understand that there is that line that can be drawn when all is said and done?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. When it comes to purporting evidence, make sure that the hardest evidence that you're looking at should be in what's called a peer-reviewed journal. So basically, that goes through a lot of checks and balances to make sure
Hmm.
that the science is sound.
Right.
A good follow-up to that could be presentations at conferences where you have use cases and case studies, usually presented by an employer, saying, "Well, this is what we did. This is why we did it, and this was the outcome. We invested in the health of our people. We set up an on-site fitness facility. We actually got people to use it, and we got better
Hmm.
outcomes for what it is that we were measuring in there." So data usually trumps opinion, in my opinion and perspective, and so I'm,
As
I'm
it should.
quite yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, because without data you just have an opinion, which really doesn't provide that much
Sure.
in the grand scheme of things, right?
Right.
So Did you want me to touch on some of the evidence that is
I would love that. Yeah, absolutely.
okay? Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a good idea too. Now, there's two types of approaches that I like to use whenever I'm working with an employer, and these are all based upon either single studies. So, in other words, it's at one employer where they study. It's the same benefit plan, the same culture, same everything. Or there's other types of studies that are called systematic reviews or meta-analyses, and these are
Mhm.
basically studies of studies. So you could have maybe 50 research articles and 50 different studies that are now looked at together. And this is where you kind of get away from, what I like to call the coffee paradox. Is coffee good for you today or is it bad for you? Well, one study found this and then another study found
I've
this.
never heard that
And
before. I love it.
yeah, go figure, right? So when you look at systematic reviews and meta-analysis, they're looking at studies of studies, and they're trying to figure out, where's the general direction here? Less
Right.
of the magnitude sort of thing, but more along the lines of what should the outcomes generally be.
Right.
Um, and so a couple of different studies, and if we look at physical fitness, for example, a really good systematic review was published just a few months ago in the Journal of Occupational Health. And what they found is that for every $1 invested in a physical fitness type programming, the return was about $3.60, which is pretty
Okay.
strong. And that's based upon
Right.
1,000 studies that were reviewed, and close to 100,000 people included in that. And that's one way to look at it.
Hmm.
Now, one of the other ways that I use, Ann, which is I've always felt to be quite compelling, and it's something I talk about a lot in the presentations and keynotes that I give, as well as when I interact with employers, is I look at studies that have been done on the stock market performance of organizations who've received awards or who are known to have not just a generous benefit plan, but a culture that supports and promotes and protects the health of their people. And so, the magnitude changes a little bit. When this was first done, the return was about 325% on a
Wow.
basket of companies who are known to invest in the health of their people, versus
Hmm.
about 105% return for those who are in the other category.
Got it.
And that's a pretty powerful message, right? Especially
Yes.
if you're dealing with, how do we find dollars? People are trying to do more with less. How do we find dollars to help fund this sort of thing?
That's a really interesting approach. I love it. We should be looking at things like that much more, I think. Um, when you think about organizations that are out there, what would be the ideal approach that you would want to share with them so that they could determine the value of their program?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, I like to cast the net far and wide, and that works both ways. Integrated strategies work best. Historically, these silos that we've had don't necessarily give us the best results, right? If you
Right,
have
right.
all these siloed approaches where nobody's talking to one another, well, it's not good for the worker, it's not good for the organization. It definitely doesn't work very well. So when you have integrated strategies, you can begin to link the elements of that return on investment and value on investment approach. So things like participant outcomes, who are they, how often, how are you measuring these sort of things, and really what the organization is interested in.
Hmm.
And then condition outcomes, how do you measure prevention, for example? This is always an interesting question. What's the value of preventing that case of cancer that I mentioned earlier? Did your program actually do it, or were there other factors that were contributing to it? And that's where these broader sort of conversations come from. Financial outcomes should always be part of the conversation. Which one? Is it the health plan spend? Is it the pharmacy spend? Is it your overall healthcare cost? I usually throw in absenteeism and presenteeism measures, employee satisfaction, employee morale, the concept of engagement, and then really tie it back to what it is that we're trying to impact.
Are we able to make a link directly to ROI where engagement's concerned?
Yeah, engagement is an interesting one. I try and rename this concept of engagement as participation because that's really what they're trying to get to. Now, I think that you have to have the right type of engagement, for lack of a better
Hmm.
term, in the sense that you're focusing on the right people who are those who are in need of those interventions the most, and you're
Mm-hmm.
getting them to participate in the programming. So I see a lot of employers talking about engagement. Some are focusing in on the original definition of the term. Some are using it as a surrogate for participation. At the end of the
Mm-hmm.
day, you call it whatever you want. You really want to get people to use the programming and leverage the benefits that the organization is offering up.
Yeah. Well, I love what you said too, because when I'm hearing engagement a lot from the different companies that are out there, it's just too broad based. And it's just like, and I think it really is becoming participation versus engagement. So I hear you loud and clear. I think that's a really important delineation to make. So, well,
Mhm.
listen, we are almost out of time. Dr. Amell, thank you so much for everything so far. But before we go, I want to wrap up. I do have a quickie quiz that I share with my guests.
Oh, you
Um,
didn't tell me there was going to be a test,
Oh, well,
Anne.
there was a little quiz. It's a fun one, though.
Okay.
You have dedicated your career to helping others and helping organizations care for their employees. I want to know how you take care of yourselves. So, what is your favorite form of exercise right now?
Ooh, favorite form of exercise right now. Well, I'm fortunate enough to have a Peloton, so that's
Hmm.
how I ride. I get my mountain biking fix when the weather's not necessarily on board with that.
All right. What is your favorite healthy snack to give you all your energy?
Oh, so this is an easy one for me. Fresh fruit,
Okay.
blueberries, raspberries, strawberries, those sort of
Good time of
things,
year for
acai
those.
berries. Yeah, absolutely. And and nuts. I combine them together, so it's kind of like a hybrid trail mix sort of thing. But it really gives you a huge amount of energy, antioxidants, and a lot of anti-inflammatory properties associated, particularly with blueberries. And so,
The last question is, what's your favorite form of recovery, or how do you recharge?
ooh, yeah. So listening to music is probably how I
That's a good one.
decompress.
What music? What's your favorite?
Yeah. So I was reading a study on this. It's funny you should ask that. Um, People default to certain types of music, and it turns out that the music that they prefer through their entire lives is the music that they were really into when they're like 17, 18, 19, 20,
Ah,
21 or so. So if you think back to your favorite music and the best music you've ever experienced, that's the window. I was really into alternative type music back in the
mm-hmm.
day when I was in that age frame, and that's what I default to. When I go to Spotify or Apple Music,
Right?
those are the ones I request.
Makes a lot of sense. I love it. Well, I love how curious you are too. You seem to take a really curious stance on anything you get involved with and really dig in. So that's great. Well, listen, that wraps up our time today. Thank you so much for joining me. And also thank you to our listeners for tuning in.